maybe more of a moderated conversation. I think one of the things that America's Future Foundation really wants to do is we're not into being partisan political discussions, we're into policy debates, talking about issues, not getting stuck in the political mess, and talking about it from both sides and really having an open debate about things. And so I think this issue particularly, privacy and national security and how they meet in the crossroads there is a really interesting one for us to dive into. I think it affects everybody in here, whether you have ever owned a credit card or ever got on the internet or ever talked on the phone or whatever it is, you've seen the intertwinings there, and all of us were affected by 9/11 and other terroristic type things that affect our national security. So I think this applies to everybody on both sides, and I think it's going to be interesting to hear from these two gentlemen tonight. First, I want to introduce Ladar Levinson, who founded LavaBit. Some of you may have heard of LavaBit. It is kind of like Gmail, but a lot more secure in the fact that they don't necessarily read your emails and tell you what you should buy next. LavaBit gained a lot of popularity because Edward Snowden used LavaBit to do some of his email communications, and that led to all sorts of fun legal battles that Ladar has been in for the last few years. But anyway, I'm going to open up to him first. He's going to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes, give you sort of opening remarks on his thoughts on national security and freedom and privacy, and then I'll turn it over to our other debater. So, Ladar.
Thank you, Michael. Quickly realizing I have really poor timing. He introduced me, and then I realized I should have asked for a bathroom break because I'm probably going to be up here a while. Goes a little bit further than that. I created a business 10 years ago that wanted to focus on privacy, using encryption to increase the security of email. And I struggled in a very niche market for about 9 years. The market became very hot, and I somehow decided it was a good time to shut down. Again, poor timing. But what we're here to talk about today is the National Security Agency. And more specifically, what authority should our government have when it comes to conducting surveillance? It's a very old debate, one that goes back to before our country was founded. It's why the Fourth Amendment exists in our Constitution. But the debate has changed over time, and that's the result of technology. Now let me focus the question a little bit more on the National Security Agency. That's a military organization that was created by Truman in 1952 to collect intelligence on foreign powers hostile to the United States. Their leaders, their military commanders. I don't think Stephen or myself would ever argue that that isn't a vital and necessary role that our U.S. military should be playing. I'm not here to tell you the NSA shouldn't exist. I'm here to talk about what they should be allowed to collect, what they should be given access to, and how that information should be used. Specifically, what you'll hear me reiterate over the course of my argument is that I don't believe this military organization created to spy on foreign governments should be turned indiscriminately against a civilian population. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean bulk surveillance. I mean the systematic undermining of the security of the technology products that we use every day. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you we shouldn't spy on terrorists, but I will tell you that we shouldn't spy on everybody in the United States just because we think there might be a terrorist amongst the 300 million people who live here. I think our country is stronger than that, better than that. Now, this is a debate that we've had before. In 1920, the precursor to the National Security Agency set up a program in New York and struck a deal with Western Union to spy on every telegraph cable that went across our country's wires. That program lasted for 9 years and ended with the very famous quote by then Secretary of State Henry Stinson when he said, "Gentlemen don't read other people's mail." What changed? Just because the information is electronic and isn't on a piece of paper doesn't mean it shouldn't be protected? Why is it okay all of a sudden for gentlemen to read the mail of everyone else? The debate resurfaced during World War II. For almost 33 years, the United States Signals Intelligence Corps, and then later on the NSA, continued to collect and conduct surveillance operations on every telegraph cable in the country once again. It was uncovered in the 1970s by the Church Committee, ruled wholly unconstitutional, illegal, unethical, and ended. And that's where we stood for 30 years, thinking we had won, when in reality we had very much lost. The debate surfaces once again. And in truth, it was really triggered by the 9/11 attacks. A dramatic event coupled with the fear and the uncertainty caused our political leaders to uncork the capabilities of this military organization against the entire world. And that's where we sit here today, asking ourselves if they made the right decision. What should we do with this authority going forward? Now, for me personally, this issue really hinges on several things, some of which really start to irk me. Technical term. Specifically, the secrecy. How can we as a people provide oversight to our government, give them consent to conduct this surveillance if we don't know what's going on? For me personally, the line was crossed when we created secret courts that began ordering private citizens and private businesses to conduct surveillance on behalf of government, and then at the same time restricted their ability to tell anybody that it was going on. If there's anything that we should come away from today's debate thinking, it's that that needs to end. If a capability is so sensitive that it can't be used in a court of law against a private citizen, then it shouldn't be used, except in the most extreme of circumstances. If you want to keep it classified, don't use it against everyone. Now, I started this talk by saying that this is a very old debate. And this question goes back to why the Third Amendment exists. Our founding fathers thought that it was inappropriate to force private citizens to quarter soldiers in their own homes. Is it any different when we quarter those same government agents on our networks, provide them privileged access to our software? Now, some would say oversight is enough. If there's anything that I can give our current president credit for, it's that his background as a civil rights attorney has made him eminently qualified to spin all of the revelations of the last year. He's very good at using terms like adequate oversight, sufficient controls, minimization and protection of privacy, terms that put many of us at ease. But for me, secret oversight of secret programs is not enough. I don't have to look very far in history to find examples, even in our own country, of where far more limited capabilities have been abused. The McCarthy era, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, the Senate Anti-Subversive Committee, later on, the Hoover administration, and the FBI's domestic surveillance activities, codenamed COINTELPRO, that some of you may be familiar with, where the FBI basically conducted illegal surveillance on members of Congress, Robert Kennedy amongst them, against members of the civil rights movement, including Dr. King, and members of the anti-war movement, Jane Fonda. The bottom line is, if we allow these capabilities to exist, these powers to remain unchecked, whoever comes into control of them gets to determine who they're used against. And even if you agree with who they're being used against now, you might not agree with who they're used against tomorrow, particularly given the rapidly changing definition of the word terrorist. Now, the NSA wasn't completely immune from some of these scandals. Miranet was the NSA code name for their participation in COINTELPRO. They helped the FBI. Now, I'm not arguing there should be a complete separation, a Chinese wall. But I am saying we need to respect the division of labor, respect the power and authority that we've entrusted to government, and ensure they understand that they use that access and those capabilities in ways that are beyond reproach. And I don't think they can justify to any of us that they have probable cause to look at the communications of over 1 billion people, because that's how many people they're spying on every day. I have some great statistics for you. Between February 8th and March 8th of last year, the NSA picked up somewhere in the neighborhood of 124 billion phone records and 94 billion computer data records, internet search queries, meta information from emails, etc. They sorted and filtered that information into over 70 databases that they shared with their intelligence partners. Their way for getting around the law was, if they wanted to look at somebody's communications who happened to be American, was to call up a friend in a foreign intelligence agency and have them do it. The NSA has a slogan: "In God we trust, everyone else we monitor." It goes to a organizational ethos whereby the people who are operating these systems feel that they are just and right in conducting this type of surveillance. After all, they trust themselves not to abuse it. It's when we come to the question of whether or not they can gain our trust that it becomes a much trickier question. And certainly the way to do that isn't through secrecy. Even the very court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, has admitted that they don't have the resources, the skills, or the personnel to conduct oversight on the very programs that they authorize. If they can't do it, how can we? Now, whether or not you believe these powers have been abused already is a very different debate. What I want you to ask yourself today is whether or not the NSA should be continued to allow access to all of these domestic and foreign networks. And if we do allow them access, should they be allowed to store what they uncover in listening to those networks? If you start asking yourself, do we have sufficient protections in place and sufficient oversight, then the debate has already been lost. Because you're not taking these capabilities and putting them beyond the reach of weak-willed men. And if we want to ensure the protection of our future, that's what we need to do. I'm sure my esteemed colleague from Virginia is going to bring up national security. So I would say, is our nation so weak that a few men, tens of thousands of miles away, can change the very fundamental principles that make this country so great? There's no question that both of us love our country. I think the difference is that I love it enough to let it live or die as the country that I love, rather than trying to change it into something else. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Ladar. Should have my debate timer out here.
I have no idea how much time I was using.
So before everybody runs downstairs and puts tinfoil on their head, we'll listen to the other side first, and you can determine what. I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Steve Bucci, who is the director of the Allison Center of Foreign and National Security Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Steve previously worked for IBM in cybersecurity, and before that, he was a Special Forces Army officer for 3 decades for the United States Army. So I'll turn it over to you, give your counter argument, and then I have a few questions for both of you, and then we'll probably open it up to the audience for some Q&A. Steve?
Thank you. I would say don't run down and put tinfoil on your head, and I would say that my esteemed colleague is not a tinfoil wearing person by any stretch of the imagination. While we might not agree on everything, he has my admiration because he's a man who believes in the principles for which he espouses and has lived by those principles to great personal sacrifice, frankly. And anybody who's willing to do that, in my book, is worth listening to. I looked at this argument in 2 ways. The question was, you know, is the NSA violating your rights? And I threw in, just because I can't help myself, is Edward Snowden a hero? Before I answer those 2 questions, I have to tell you, coming from the Heritage Foundation, you know, people generally expect us to go one way or another. The Heritage, and I'm the defense and homeland security guy at Heritage, you know, we care a great deal about security. We care about defense, you know, all those things. We want to see our folks who have that responsibility have all the tools they need to do their jobs properly. But we also really care about the Constitution and our civil liberties and smaller government and all those other things that, frankly, have animated our organization since it started. So it's a tough task for us to deal with these problems. It's not as cut and dry as some people might think it is. So getting back to the thing, you know, what's the answer to those 2 questions? For me, the answer to both of those is no. The NSA is not violating your rights, and no, Edward Snowden is not a hero. Mr. Snowden is a person who broke the law, violated numerous agreements and oaths to which he swore, and as if we're to understand the things he has said, he knew before he took the oaths that he was going to violate them. He did it willfully. It wasn't like he got in the job, saw something, and changed his mind. He went into it with that in mind. So in my opinion, he deliberately plotted against this country. He stole well over 1 million documents, which frankly, having had my last job with IBM to review documents for the Intel community to try and give them grades by looking at all the briefings and papers and all the stuff they read, there's no way on God's green earth that Mr. Snowden read every one of those documents that he stole before he gave them to people who had no authority to read them. He just scooped them all up and dumped them out there. And so, you know, it wasn't that he found something and said, oh my gosh, here it is, I've gone over the edge and now I'm going to take this action. I also throw out that the main journalist involved, Glenn Gruden, who I had the pleasure to do a show with the week of the first release of the Snowden papers. We were talking and I made a comment about the government, which I'll elaborate on in a second, but his answer was, well, the entire government is flawed. It's all corrupt. They all need to go. So I said, well, Glenn, you're saying, you know, like both parties, all three branches of government, all of them, they are all totally corrupt. They all need to be driven out. I said, so you're, because I couldn't believe he was saying this. I said, so you're saying the entire U.S. constitutional system needs to be replaced? Absolutely. It is irreparable. I was a little at a loss to discuss it with him after that. He never really gave me an alternative to it, but that was his position. So I would say Glenn, unfortunately, had sort of gone beyond being a journalist at that point, and he was a political activist with an agenda. And I think some of the order that some of these things have been rolled out will tell you that. Okay, so that's my rant on Snowden. The NSA is not a rogue organization. All right, it is a spy agency. European political theatrics and false indignation aside, every modern nation today spies. They do it, some do it well, some do it poorly. To use the same quotation that Ladar mentioned of Henry Stimson, which he made when he was the Secretary of State, he sort of changed his mind when he became the Secretary of War during World War II, because he kind of helped lay the foundations for all these organizations that we later used for espionage. So, you know, you have to keep in mind that every country needs to have that capability. Some of us do it better than others. There's only two of the Snowden revelations that really warrant discussion here. There's been a whole bunch of others, but the two main ones are the telephony metadata program, the so-called 205 program, which looked at landline telephone calls. I didn't know this until well after the fact. They did not collect on cell phones. So all of you who don't have landlines, you have another good reason for not having one. They did it just on landlines. In fact, they were thinking of dropping the program because of it. The take they were getting was getting lower and lower because more and more people aren't using landlines anymore. And the PRISM program, the so-called 715, I'll start with that. PRISM is a legitimate, internationally focused intelligence gathering program. It was focused on foreign targets, specific foreign targets. It was never walk up to Google and Amazon and Facebook and Twitter and attach a big hose to it and suck everything out. They didn't read every email that was out there. They didn't read every tweet that everyone has written. God help them if they ever tried that. That's a false characterization of that program. They were targeted. They went to the FISA court, got permission to go after specific foreign targets, and collected the data on those. Yes, some of those companies willingly assisted with that when they went to them with a warrant. Not every company is quite like Ladar, where they came to him with a warrant and he said, sorry, I'm not giving you the stuff. I'll go out of business first. I'm not going to do that. Most companies don't. Most companies say, all right, you got a legitimate legal warrant. I'm going to comply because that's the law. And they did. Spying on foreigners is legitimate. It's absolutely needed today, and it's naively foolish to think that we don't need a robust international intel capability. Even if you are rabidly isolationist and completely against us having any foreign engagements or interventions anywhere, you'd be kind of foolish not to want to know what the rest of the world was doing, even while you're standing behind your isolationist walls. You need to, even if you don't want to have a military, you still need to have an intelligence capability. And nothing in the prison program violated your rights as American citizens. And I'll throw out the concept that the president even mentioned, that we owe the world the exact same protections and rights that we give American citizens is a ludicrous concept. We don't owe the world, no other country in the world gives foreign nationals the same protections they give their own citizens. Why in the world should we? I don't understand that one. 205, the bulk collection and retention of telephony metadata does raise a lot of concerns. It raises it for us. It should raise it for any American, because my colleague is correct. The NSA's mission is to collect foreign intelligence. It also has a protective mission of protecting our networks from foreigners. They wear two hats. They're an intelligence organization and a military organization, both. And this 205 program kind of got off in the weeds, I think. The determination, well, let's start with some facts first. The determination that metadata wasn't protected, metadata being, you know, who called, when they called, who did they call to, not by name, but by numbers. That the determination that that was not protected and did not require a warrant for them to take was not made by the NSA, it was made by the courts. It's based on established case law having to do with envelopes. All right, your return address, the address that you're sending it to, and the fact that the envelope's in the system is not protected. They don't need a warrant to get that. It's public information. You have no expectation of privacy of that information on the outside of the envelope. That was the reasoning that they used to determine that the telephony metadata could be collected. Frankly, it was collected out of an efficiency measure. It wasn't done so they could get into your knickers and find out everything that was going on. The telephone companies only keep the data for anywhere from 6 months to a year and a half for business purposes. The NSA said, you know, it would be really helpful. We could do a much better job of analysis if we had 5 years worth. But they didn't want to tell the companies, well, you guys have to keep it for 5 years because that's really expensive. So they said, well, can we keep it? And they said, because it wasn't protected data, they said, sure, go ahead. The other aspect was each of those telephone companies keep it in different formats. So when you're starting to do the analysis, it's a pain in the neck because Verizon does it one way and AT&T does it another and Sprint does it a third. So it takes you longer to do the analysis. They thought this would be faster. Seems pretty reasonable. So I have to tell you, this was an attempt by two very different administrations. You know, President Bush was not the same as President Obama in hardly any of his views. Multiple different Congresses with leadership trading hands in the different houses, the entire federal judiciary, and they, I believe, tried to do an attempt to split the difference and balance their responsibility to protect our physical well-being from attack and protect our civil liberties and constitutional rights. This should not be conflated with the IRS scandal, all right, with the DOJ surveillance of journalists, with some of the things that have been mentioned, the FBI in the 50s and 60s, the Nixon White House, all that. I'm going to read you real quickly a quotation by Dr. Jeff Stone, who was on the President's Commission to make recommendations for adjusting the programs. And Dr. Stone is a major player in the ACLU. He's on their National Advisory Council. He is a pretty strong civil liberties kind of guy and not a big fan of the NSA. And after all of the investigations that he did about the NSA, and at the end of it, he still decided the bulk collection was a bad idea and was wrong, but he said this: not only did I find out that the NSA had helped thwart numerous terrorist plots against the United States and its allies in the years since 9/11, I also found out that it is an organization that operates with a high degree of integrity and a deep commitment to the rule of law. And I won't read the rest of it, but I have to tell you, having worked with the NSA as a non-NSA guy, they're pretty obsessive people. You know, the CIA, they can get a little freelancy, wiggle around, a lot of imagination. The NSA are all engineers. They don't like breaking rules. Now, you can make the argument that the rules they were given were not the correct ones, but the NSA was not running rogue. Okay, that said, even though, in my opinion, what the 205 program did was not illegal, was not unconstitutional, bottom line was a lot of people are hugely uncomfortable with the idea of a government organization scooping up all this data and holding it for a long period of time. But there was no findings at all that the NSA did anything illegal with it, that they broke any of their rules. There were a couple of instances where for a day or so somebody got out of the lines, and the reason we know that is because there were briefings that they took to their leaders and said, hey, on Thursday we went out of the lines, we collected this, here's how we purged it, here's the steps we're taking to make sure we don't get out of that line again, and here's what we did to the people who made this mistake, which were released by Mr. Snowden in some of his releases. The bottom line is that people were uncomfortable with what might be done with this information, not what was done with it. Bottom line, the bulk collection and retention of this data is going to end. I don't think anybody doubts that. The President's recommendation was ended. The House Intel Committee's recommendation is ended. They looked at it and they said, you know, the 5-year thing, we can live without that. The different formats that slows us down a little bit, we can live without getting it all in one format. So I believe what you're going to end up seeing is that they're going to tell the companies that they're going to keep the data. They won't give them direction of how long. And they will still be able to go to a court episodically with specific legal documentation that they have a reason to know Steve Bucci's information. If Steve Bucci turns out to be a U.S. national, they will bring the FBI into it, because for U.S. people, that's their thing. If it's a foreign national, the NSA will continue with that warrant to get that information from the phone companies and to work it. There is one other option, to have a third party hold it. That's kind of a silly idea, but I'll talk about that in Q&A if you want. Frankly, the ACLU has weighed in and said they are comfortable with this plan. There's a couple other aspects of the two programs, but the main thing is end the bulk collection and retention and only do it through specific warrants. And I'll stop with this. Look, Snowden, if he'd only released the thing on the 205 program, the telephone metadata, he might have been a whistleblower. Even if he had done 205 and 715, which really didn't turn out to be anything, maybe he's still a whistleblower. A little debatable. But the fact that he stole over 1 million documents and dumped them without any sort of vetting, that's not whistleblowing. That's espionage. He is the biggest, most egregious espionage perpetrator in our company's history. If you count volume, he exceeded Bradley Manning, who only took about 70,000 documents, and most of his were secret, not top secret. And I have to tell you, the fact that Mr. Snowden ended up in Russia, not exactly a beacon of civil liberties and individual rights, something that Walter Pincus talks about in today's Washington Post. Heritage guys love quoting the Washington Post, by the way. It's kind of fun, because we don't do it very often. Where he didn't bother to call Mr. Putin on his little television discussion on what the Russians do for their people, because it's far more intrusive than anything we have ever thought about doing here. He is not a hero. He should be prosecuted. His actions revealed no criminal behavior that has been pointed to or had action taken on. Just because you don't like something the government does, it doesn't mean it's unconstitutional, that your rights are being violated. We are having this debate. I think the systems will change, as I mentioned. But no, the NSA is not violating your rights, and we need to kind of calm down a little bit and discuss it reasonably and not with some of the cartoonish ways of describing it. I'm not characterizing anything that was said here as that. I've had lots of discussions with lots of people, some in my own organization, who frankly don't want to get beyond the cartoon. And we need to do that because we do have a responsibility to protect this nation as well as protect our rights.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to give Ladar 2 minutes to sort of respond, and then I want to open up to questions. I have questions too, but I'll make sure you all get a chance to ask questions too. So I'll give you a couple minutes to sort of respond to some of what we just heard, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A.
I created a little cheat sheet on what different government organizations think about when your rights are actually violated. For the courts and the Department of Justice, your rights aren't violated unless the illegally obtained information is used against you in a court of law. For the FBI, your rights aren't violated if only a machine looks at the information and then discards it. For the National Security Agency, your rights are only violated if a human looks at your information. And the CIA, their response is, you have rights?
He's working for the CIA too.
The question you have to ask yourself is, where is the line drawn? What we're learning now is that information collected by the NSA or the FBI through one of their domestic surveillance programs is actually being shared under the table with other federal agencies like the IRS or the Transportation Security Administration, such that the NSA tells the IRS, hey, Stephen here is getting 1 email a month from this Swiss bank. Maybe you should conduct an audit. Or the TSA gets a heads up because your favorite cabbie who gives you a ride to work every morning at the same time happens to be on a government watch list, and they pick up the fact that your cell phone and his cell phone happen to be traveling in the same car 5 days a week. And then you get the rubber glove treatment the next time you come from out of the country. The problem with saying that these programs complied with the law is that we don't know what the law is. When the interpretation of the law is secret, how can the public be expected to give consent? March, I believe it was 23rd of last year, James Clapper was testifying before the Senate Committee on Foreign Intelligence and was asked if the NSA collected data on domestic citizens. And his answer was no. Only weeks later, we found out about PRISM. His response, well, metadata isn't data. Apparently, he goes by a different dictionary. His dictionary is classified. And that's the problem. If the FISC is going to secretly interpret Section 215 of the Patriot Act in a different way from what the people who wrote it intended, shouldn't they tell somebody? Don't we have a right to know that? Don't we have a right to complain to Congress? Some of you know I went through a very interesting period in my life last summer where I got to spend a little time in Washington, D.C. And one of the very first things I learned from somebody who's plugged in to many of the politicians there was they don't want to know. Congress doesn't want to know what these intelligence agencies are doing because if they know, they might have to do something about it. We all want to be safe. Only a handful of us are willing to know how we go about doing that. And I really think all of us need to be aware of how we go about doing that. On the topic of Snowden, it's probably more complicated than I have time to talk about. But the simple fact is, how else would we know about any of these programs if not for him? I'm sure Stephen would argue that he could have gone to the Inspector General, just like Thomas Drake did. I don't know how many of you know what happened to him, He lost his security clearance, had his house raided, and ended up in a protracted legal battle for over a year before all 10 charges were dropped. Because a reporter found out about a classified program from somebody other than him, but because he was the one who complained to the Inspector General, he was the one that got the finger pointed at him. He loves his country just like all of us. He tried to do the right thing, and it blew up in his face. And Edward Snowden saw that and decided that the only way he was going to get this information out was by going direct to the people, by exercising his First Amendment rights for the very reason that those First Amendment rights exist. He did that knowing full well that he may have to pay a price someday. And whether he pays that price is a much more personal decision. But as someone who also had to sacrifice his interests for the benefit of everyone else, I tend to empathize with somebody who made a similar choice in a much more personal way.